The wind comes down out of the mountains first. It moves across a valley of black timber and frost-white grass, past a lonely wagon trail that winds toward a town of plank houses and thin blue chimney smoke. A church steeple rises against a sky the color of hammered pewter. Something is falling. Not snow, something colder. Inside a small pine-walled hall, three men sit behind a long oak table. A sheet of paper trembles between bloodless fingers. A word is read aloud. Generous. A young woman stands alone before them. Her black wool dress has been mended twice at the elbows. Her hair is pulled back so tight not a single strand strays. She does not weep. She does not plead. Gray eyes lift slowly, meeting the banker's spectacles across the room. Two words leave her mouth flat and hard as a riverstone. I see. The wind that came down out of the San Juan Mountains on the morning of October 14th, 1883, carried the first true bite of winter, a thin, whistling cold that slipped under coat collars and made grown men clench their jaws against it. In the little logging town of Hollowford Bend, Colorado, the aspens along the ridge had already surrendered their gold, their bare branches clawing at a sky the color of hammered pewter. Smoke rose straight up from the chimneys of the plank houses on Main Street, thin blue columns that told anyone who cared to read them that the pressure was falling, that something harder than autumn was moving in from the peaks. In the small town hall, a room no larger than a good-sized parlor, three men sat behind a long oak table waiting to pass judgment on a 19-year-old widow. Merritt Halloway walked through the door alone. She wore a black wool dress that had been mended twice at the elbows, a shawl the color of dried moss, a boots that had belonged to her husband before the Ponderosa took him. Her hair, the flat brown of Riverstone, was pulled back so severely that not a single strand strayed. She did not look at the townspeople crowded along the back wall, the ones who had come to watch a young widow lose everything, the way they might have come to watch a horse race, with a kind of embarrassed excitement they would deny later at supper. She looked only at the three men behind the table waiting to be spoken to. Barnaby Thorne cleared his throat with the small, precise sound of a man clearing a ledger of an inconvenient entry. He was thin silver at the temples, his spectacles catching the lamplight in a way that made his eyes look like two coins pressed into his skull. He held a sheet of paper in fingers that had never known a callus. The paper trembled slightly, though not from any feeling on his part, only because the drafty room had a way of moving small things. He read the judgment in the flat cadence of a man reading a grocery list, as though each word were the same weight as the last, as though a woman's home were no different from a barrel of flour. In light of the outstanding debts of the late Elias Halloway, in the sum of $112, the council finds it necessary to reclaim the cabin, the associated 160 acres as collateral, the property being assessed at the sum of $15, the town being generous in its accounting. The word generous did something to the air of the room. It thickened it. Merritt's chest went hollow in a way she recognized the same hollowness that had spread through her the morning they carried her husband out of the timber 6 weeks before. Only now there were no tears left to fill it, only a cold, clean space where feeling had been. To her right, Reverend Ephraim Whitlock adjusted his considerable weight in a chair that had not been built for him. His piety was famous in the valley, so was his appetite, the two seeming to feed each other in some private economy she had never understood. He folded his soft pink hands across the black cloth of his vest. It is a sad providence, Miss Halloway, a test of faith sent by the Almighty, for reasons we cannot presume to know, but the laws of man, like the laws of the good, Lord, must be respected for without order. There is no mercy, without mercy, there is no civilization. His voice had the practiced roll of a Sunday sermon delivered to a congregation of one. At the far end of the table sat the third man. The third man cut her worst. Cyrus Rennick was the master carpenter of Hollowford Bend, the builder of nearly every roof in the valley. He had been her husband's closest friend. He had taught Elias to swing an axe when Elias was still a boy of 14 with more nerve than sense. He had stood up at their wedding 2 years ago, made a toast that had made the whole church laugh, then cry. He sat now with his big scarred hands resting on his knees, his gray beard combed but tired, his eyes fixed on a knot in the pine floorboards, as though the knot contained some private answer he was studying. He did not look up. He did not speak. His silence was a thing she felt against her skin like a slap. Thorne produced a second document with the same weightless motion he had produced the first. The town and its charity offers the use of the old trapper's shack down by Kettle Brook on unclaimed ground, While the squatting is technically an irregularity, the council is willing to overlook the matter for the duration of the season. For the season. She turned those three small words over in her mind, the way a jeweler turns a stone, saw the true face of them. Until the thaw, if she lasted that long. The shack down by Kettle Brook was not a dwelling. It was a landmark for hunters, the place where the valley trail met the water. No one had slept in it for 10 years, except porcupines. The porcupines had left when the roof began to sag. She did not plead. She had considered pleading on the walk down from the shack that morning, had turned the possibility over in her mouth like a stone had tasted how the words might sound, had spit the stone out into the frost. Elias had married a woman who did not beg. Elias was gone. She was not going to become someone he would not have recognized in the last minute she had left of being his widow in the eyes of the town. She lifted her chin. She let her gray eyes settle on Barnaby Thorne for the first time, held them there until he was forced to notice her. When he did, she saw the faint distaste that flickered behind his spectacles, the discomfort of a man who preferred his victims soft. I see. The two words came out flat, small, hard, as a river pebble dropped onto a plate. She turned. She walked back down the aisle between the townspeople she had known her whole married life, past the mercantile owner who had once given her a piece of horehound candy for being polite, past the seamstress who had let out the waist of her wedding dress for free, past faces that would not meet her eye, now that meeting her eye had become expensive. She walked out of the town hall, the door closing behind her with a small final click that would ring in her ears for the rest of her days. Outside, the cold hit her like clean water. She stood on the plank walk for a moment, let it wash her. Above the false fronts of Main Street, the peaks of the San Juan stood white already at their tops, indifferent as they had been indifferent to every human matter since the first man had wandered up into them. A wagon rolled past with a load of freshly split cordwood, the driver averting his eyes. That averted glance told her more about the days ahead than any judgment Thorne could read from a sheet of paper. She had become invisible. Invisibility was going to be the first thing she had to survive. It was not the last. The walk to the shack was 2.5 miles down the valley trail. She made it with the sun sliding sideways behind the western ridge. Kettle Brook ran fast, dark on her left, fed by a spring that came up out of the mountain not a mile above. Even now, with frost stiff along its edges, the middle of the water was black, moving, refusing to freeze. She listened to it as she walked. There was something in the sound of that water that steadied her, though she could not have said what. Her grandmother would have said the water was talking. Her grandmother had said a lot of things. The shack came into view at the last bend. It was worse than the memory she had been carrying. It leaned to the south as though exhausted by the mere fact of standing. The roof was a patchwork of split cedar hope. The hope had gone out of it a long time ago. Half the shingles were missing. The window on the north wall was a black square, its glass long since taken by weather or boys with rocks. The door hung from one leather hinge, the other hinge no more than a rust stain on the frame. There was no porch. There was no path. The dead grass grew right up to the sill. She stepped inside. The smell of old animal wet earth rose up to meet her. The interior was a single room, 12 feet by 14, floored in nothing but packed dirt, gone soft with the season's damp. In one corner, a rat had built a nest out of the shredded remains of a burlap sack. In another, the roof had let enough water through over enough years that the wall had begun to bloom with a dark green rot she could smell from the door. The wind came through the wall in 100 small whistles, each at a slightly different pitch, so that standing inside the shack was like standing inside a poorly tuned instrument playing a single terrible chord. Her possessions arrived the next morning, hauled down from the cabin by a boy she paid in the promise of the copper kettle when she was done with it. A single handcart. A cast iron stove that had cost Elias 3 months of wages would now have to keep her alive. A bedroll. A wooden box of kitchen implements, most of them chipped. A canvas roll containing every tool Elias had owned, from the felling axe to the small brass spirit level he had been so proud of. The book. Small leather bound, its cover soft as skin from 3 generations of handling, its pages full of the spidery handwriting of the woman who had raised her father in a hollow of the Blue Ridge before ever coming west. That book weighed almost nothing. It was the heaviest thing she owned. The first night she slept on the packed earth in every blanket she possessed. The earth pulled the warmth out of her, the way a wick pulls oil out of a lamp. She woke at some black hour with the taste of iron in her mouth, the certain knowledge, plain, unornamented, that she would not live to see April if she did not do something the town would find impossible. The wind had turned in the night. It came now not from the west, but from the north. The north wind in these mountains carried a message every homesteader learned to read. The message was that a hard country was about to become harder, that if you had not yet made your peace with the ground you were standing on, you were about to be given a very short opportunity to try. She sat up in the dark, struck a match. The match flared, showed her the frost blooming on the inside of the north wall, and delicate ferns went out. She did not light another. She sat with her arms around her knees. She let herself think for the first time since the burial about the shape of what had happened to her, about the shape of what she was going to have to become in order to survive it. In the darkness, the shape of her grandmother's voice came back to her, unbidden, low, steady as a creek under ice. "The earth has two hearts, child." The old woman had said it 100 times when Merritt was small in the kitchen of the cabin in Virginia before the family came west, the words rising out of the same mouth that told her when to shell peas, when to fetch kindling. There is the fire heart deep down where no living thing goes. There is the warm heart just under the frost. The frost is only a thin blanket. Under the blanket, the earth is always kind, if you know how to ask. Delphia Halloway had lived 31 winters in a house that was half sunk into the side of a Blue Ridge hollow, a house her own husband had called a badger's den, until the winter he learned better. She had never once in those 31 winters had a floor that froze. By the time the eastern ridge showed the first thin gray of dawn, Merritt was on her feet. She had not eaten. She had not washed. She had a plan. The plan was so large, so unlikely, that she was afraid to let it stop moving in her mind for fear it would fall over. She wrapped her shawl tight, took Elias's shovel, his pickaxe from the canvas roll, stepped out into the frost-white grass to walk the perimeter of the ground she had been sentenced to. What the council had meant as a grave, she meant to turn into something they did not yet have a word for. The shack sat on a gentle slope about 50 yards above the bank of Kettle Brook. The slope was almost exactly the gradient she needed, which she took not as luck, but as the first small nod from a piece of country that had so far offered her nothing else. She paced it off twice, marking corners with sticks, checking her line of sight to the water. The brook itself ran between two low banks of stone gravel. Even in the pale early light, she could see the black moving thread of open water down its center, the spring feed too warm, too fast to freeze, except at its very edges. That moving water was the second nod. It was, in fact, the whole reason the plan could work at all. Her grandmother's people back in the hollows of western Virginia had called it a breathing hearth. It was not a phrase you heard in the mercantiles of Colorado. It was not a phrase you heard in the pulpits either. It was a piece of knowledge that had come down through the women of certain families, the way a recipe for bread comes down without ceremony, without being written on anything more permanent than the inside of a granddaughter's memory. The principle was as simple as it was disbelieved. Deep earth held a steady temperature all year, a little above freezing, no matter what the sky was doing overhead. Moving water held the same. If you dug a channel that connected the deep, still air of the ground, the deep, still air of a running creek, to the underside of a floor. If you gave the colder air inside the house a place to sink, leave the ground itself would breathe a slow, patient warmth up into your feet all winter long. No fire could do what the earth could do, because a fire warmed only what was near it, the earth warmed from below. She would need to dig a trench, not a foundation trench, but a channel the channel would have to run from beneath the middle of the shack, down the slope, out into the gravel bed of Kettle Brook itself. It would have to go deep, deeper than the frost line, which in this valley in a bad year reached 6 feet. It would have to slope at a constant, gentle angle, 1 inch of drop for every 10 feet of run, so the air would flow without help from a bellows or a wheel. It would have to be lined so the earth around it did not fall and choke it. It would have to end at the shack in a sealed chamber under a new wooden floor. It would have to open at the creek at a point protected from rodents' floods. It was laid out plainly, the work of 4 strong men, a summer of daylight. She had 1 woman, 1 shovel, 8 weeks before the killing cold. She began before the sun cleared the ridge. She stepped back into the shack, walked to the middle of the dirt floor with the point of the pickaxe. She scratched a rectangle 3 feet wide, 8 feet long. She looked at the rectangle for a long moment. Then she lifted the pickaxe over her shoulder, brought it down. The sound of iron biting into cold ground rang against the sagging walls, like the first note of a hymn no one else in Hollowford Bend could hear. She walked into town that afternoon with her chin lifted, her cheeks stinging from the wind. She went not to the bank, not to the church, but to the mercantile at the corner of Main Spruce. The proprietor was a decent man named Halloran, who had known her husband, who had the grace to look uncomfortable when she came in, which she took as more decency than she had seen from anyone else since her widowhood. She did not waste his time. She unpinned from the inside of her collar the small gold locket Elias had given her. The second month they were married, opened it once to show him the pressed Edelweiss inside, then closed it, set it on the counter without ceremony. Halloran looked at the locket, then at her. Something in his face pulled tight. "Miss Halloway." He hesitated. "There must be another way." "There must be." She met his eye. "There is not." She kept her voice level because if she had let the smallest tremble into it, she would have taken the locket back, walked out into the cold with nothing. Nothing would have killed her by January. He gave her $7 for a locket worth 12. It was not cheating. It was as much as he could give her without his own wife asking him hard questions. At supper, she understood that too. She thanked him for it. She spent $6.52 on 20 rough-sawn pine planks, 10 feet long on a box of 6-penny nails, on 3 lengths of 6-inch terracotta drainage pipe, on a small bundle of tarred oakum. She walked out with 48 cents in her pocket. It was the last money she had in the world. She arranged for Halloran's boy to cart the materials to the edge of town no further because she could not spare a cent for the extra haul. She herself carried the terracotta pipe 1 length at a time down the 2.5 miles to the shack because terracotta broken in a wagon rut is terracotta wasted. Each length weighed close to 40 pounds. She made the trip 6 times before dark. By the last trip, her arms were shaking so hard she had to set the pipe down twice in the road, stand still, with her hands on her knees, breathing white plumes into the falling night. When she finally reached the shack, she did not go inside. She stood beside the neat little stack of pipe under the eave. She said very quietly to no one well. It was a small word, but she said it the way another woman might have said, "Amen." She began the second day of digging before sunrise. The second day taught her what the first had only hinted at. A foot down the soft topsoil gave way to a dense gray clay riddled with river cobble, the size of a man's fist. The pickaxe rang against the cobble like a bell. Each ring traveled up the handle into the bones of her wrists, stayed there. She learned within the first hour that she could not swing the pickaxe the way a strong man swings it. If she swung it with her arms gave out inside of 10 minutes. She had to swing it with her whole body, letting the weight of it fall, guiding rather than driving, using her breath the way she had watched her grandmother use breath while chopping stove wood at 70 years old. Breath in on the lift, breath out on the strike. The pickaxe was not a weapon. The pickaxe was a partner. She learned other things. She learned to shovel with her boot, not her back. She learned that the bucket she was hauling out held about 30 pounds of clay when full, that if she filled it 3/4 full, she could carry it all day, but if she filled it to the rim, she could carry it for 1 hour no more. She learned that her hands, soft still from a life of keeping house for a husband who was gentle about such things, had a limit. She found the limit on the afternoon of the second day, when the blister on her right palm burst under the shovel handle, left a smear of clear fluid pink blood on the ash. She wrapped the hand in a strip torn from a petticoat she would not be needing this winter. She kept digging. The wrapping went dark stiff. She did not look at it again until night. By the end of the 4th day, the pit inside the shack was 4 feet deep. The pile of excavated clay outside the door had begun to look from a distance like a small barrow raised by some vanished people over the grave of a chieftain. She had not seen a human face since Halloran's boy. She had not spoken a word aloud since the well. She had eaten a handful of boiled beans in the morning, a handful of boiled beans in the evening. She had made a broth from 3 bones. A neighbor's dog had left in the road which she had scrubbed clean in the creek without shame. Her body ached in places she had not previously known were separate places. She slept as though she had been dropped from a height. She did not dream. It was on the 5th day that she had her first visitors. They came together, which told her something before either of them spoke. Reverend Whitlock filled the doorway of the shack with his black bulk, breathing a little hard from the walk. Cyrus Rennick stood behind him, taller, quieter, his gray beard bright against the dark of his coat. They looked in, they saw her at the bottom of a pit, up to her chest in it, a smudge of clay across her cheekbone. Her hair, coming loose in a way that would have humiliated her 3 months ago, did not touch her now. The Reverend's soft pink mouth opened before his brain had caught up with what his eyes were showing him. Good heavens, child. What in the world is the meaning of this? Are you digging some sort of root cellar in the middle of a floor? She set the point of the shovel into the clay, rested her weight on the handle. She let a full breath go before she answered him. I am improving my foundation, Reverend. Rennick stepped past the Reverend into the shack. His experienced eyes went to the pit, to the barrow of spoil outside, to the neat stack of terracotta pipe pine planks under the eave. His face did what a builder's face does when it sees work it does not understand, which is to close down like a shutter. That is no foundation. A foundation goes under the walls, not under the middle of a floor. What you are digging is a sump. You will fill this shack to the sill the first spring rain. The trench will run downhill, Mr. Rennick. To the creek, it is for air, not for water. Rennick made a sound in his throat that was not quite a laugh, not quite a cough. Air. You are ruining a perfectly serviceable shack girl chasing air. He kicked at a lump of clay, watched it roll. What you need is a good hot stove, a cord of seasoned oak, not a hole in the ground, to let the cold up in the winter. This is woman's folly. You do not know the first thing about building. Elias, God rest him, would have known better. He would have set you straight. The name did what he had meant it to do, which was to try to open a door she had spent 6 weeks nailing shut. She did not let him. Her voice when it came was as level as the spirit level she had used that morning to check the run of the trench. My grandmother taught me some things about the ground. Reverend Whitlock stepped closer, filling the doorway with his careful concern, the way a certain kind of man fills every room he ever enters. Old wives' tales, my dear. Superstition dressed in a homespun apron. The Lord provides through honest labor sound principles, not through burrowing in the earth like a badger. I urge you, Miss Halloway, cease this strange labor. Come into town. Mrs. Thorne is in need of a girl in her kitchen. I have already spoken to her about the possibility. There it was. The offer they had been aiming her toward from the beginning. Not charity, but service dressed in the language of rescue. A place in the kitchen of the man who had taken her land. She thought about it for the length of one breath, then she drove the shovel down into the clay again. The scraping sound filled the shack, made the Reverend take an involuntary step back. Thank you for your concern, Reverend. I will see this through. She did not look up from her work. After a long moment, she heard the two of them turn, walk out into the wind. She heard the Reverend say something low to Rennick that she could not make out. She heard Rennick not answer. She waited until their bootsteps were gone. Then she straightened. She stood in the pit, let her back unbend one vertebra at a time. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until the pressure took the water back. When she took her hands away, her palms had left red half-moons on her cheekbones. She looked around at the pit, at the barrow of spoil, at the small stack of pine planks that were meant to save her life. She nodded once to herself, a small business-like nod. She picked up the shovel. She went back to work. The visit had cost her something. She could feel the cost. But it had also done a thing she had not expected, which was to close the last small door in her that might still have been listening for permission. The trench grew, 15 feet, then 20, then 30. She had begun outside the shack, now working her way down the slope toward the creek. The work outside was in some ways harder because the wind found her here. The sun did not reach the bottom of the cut until nearly noon. At 8 feet down, the shovel began to strike a different kind of soil, sandier, shot through with the smooth river stone that told her she was inside the old floodplain of Kettle Brook. The digging became easier, more dangerous at the same time. The walls of the trench began to want to fall in on her. She spent an afternoon she could not spare cutting shoring boards from 4 of her precious planks, wedging them across the trench at intervals. She reminded herself that a plank spent on shoring was a plank she would not have for the floor. She did the arithmetic in her head as she worked. She came out just barely on the side of survival. By the end of the second week, her body had begun to change. The blisters on her palms had reformed broken again, until they hardened into a callus that no longer split. Her shoulders had thickened in a way she noticed one morning when she pulled her dress on. It fit differently across the back. Her forearms, always slender, had grown a rope of muscle along the outside that she could roll under her thumb like a green stem. Her face had gone thinner. Her eyes, in the small cracked mirror she kept in the kitchen box, had gone from gray to a paler color that she did not entirely recognize, a color like the sky over the ridge on a morning that meant to snow. She looked at that face for a long moment. One dawn she thought, without any drama, that a widow of 19 was becoming something else. She did not yet know the name for it. She had run out of beans on the 10th day. On the 11th, she set 3 wire snares along the runs in the willow thicket by the creek. On the 12th, she checked them, found a young cottontail in the middle one, its neck cleanly broken by the wire. She thanked the rabbit the way her grandmother had thanked every animal Delphia had ever taken quietly. Without embarrassment, she skinned it, stewed it with a wild onion she had dug from the creek bank. She ate the whole of it in 2 sittings, slept better that night than she had slept since the burial. She kept the pelt. Every scrap of anything was going to matter. Before this was finished, the pelt would line a mitten. The first real snow fell on the 9th of November, a dry powder that came in sideways for an hour before dawn, then stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only a fine dusting on the ridges, a warning in the air. She stood in the trench that morning with the powder collecting in the brim of her hat. She measured with her eye the distance she still had to go. She measured with her body the strength she still had to give. She made a private arrangement between the 2 numbers. She would finish. She would finish because the alternative was not finishing. The alternative had a name. The name was Mrs. Thorne's kitchen. She would sooner sleep out in the timber under her shawl than sleep another night in the town that had thrown her away. The tunnel through the last of the creek bank was the worst of it. She had reached a point 6 feet from the water where she had to burrow horizontally through the bank rather than dig from above, because to dig from above would have cut the bank, let the creek in to fill her whole works. She lay on her belly in the trench, reached forward with a short-handled trowel she had cut down from a broken hoe. She pulled dirt back toward her. In small handfuls she inched forward as the dirt gave way. The cold from the water on the other side of the bank came through the earth into her ribs, stayed there. Twice the bank tried to close over her. Twice she backed out fast, heart hammering, shored the passage with the last of her spare planking. On the 3rd attempt she pushed through into open air. Cold creek light fell across her face. She smelled the wet stone smell of the brook. She laughed once, one short bark of a laugh that was the first sound of joy she had made since the burial. She fitted the terracotta pipe into the tunnel that same afternoon, 3 lengths of it, each seated into the next with a collar of the tarred oakum she had bought at Halloran's. The open end at the creek she protected with a small grate she wove from a coil of fencing wire she found rusting under the eave of the shack. She set the mouth of the pipe just above the winter low water line, but well within the mass of the bank, so that the air being drawn in would be the deep earth's air, not the sharp wind off the surface of the water. She stood with her hand on the last section of pipe for a moment before she covered it. She thought about how strange it was that a woman with 48 cents to her name had just laid a piece of engineering into a Colorado creek bank that not one man in Hollowford Bend would have believed possible if he had not seen it. Back at the shack, at the top of the run, she did the work her grandmother had described in the softest voice, the voice Delphia had used only when she was telling something she considered important. Merritt could not afford pipe for the whole length of the trench. She had known that from the start. Instead, along the 60 feet between the creek, the shack she built with her own hands, a stone conduit. She gathered flat stones from the bed of Kettle Brook, wading in water so cold it made her feet feel first like fire, then like nothing at all. She carried the stones up the slope in a burlap sack that soaked through, grew heavier with every trip. She laid the flat stones as a floor along the bottom of the trench. She built low parallel walls of larger stones along each side, an inside width of 8 inches, an inside height of about a foot. She capped the whole channel with more flat stones overlapping like slate on a roof. Then she covered the cap with a thick layer of coarse creek gravel that would let air through but keep out fine soil. Only then did she begin the long, slow work of backfilling the trench, returning to the ground, the mountain of clay she had lifted out of it, tamping each layer down with the flat of the shovel, the heels of her boots. When she was done, the only sign from the outside of 2 months of labor was a long, slightly raised mound in the earth, running from the shack to the creek, already softening into the slope, already becoming part of the country. From inside the shack, the only sign was a dark opening in the earth beneath the middle of the floor. A mouth, a place from which the ground would speak. She built the plenum chamber over the mouth in a single long day, working by lantern into the night. Because the sky had turned the color of a bruise, she could feel the second snow gathering. The plenum was a shallow sealed box of pine, 2 feet deep, its inside walls smeared with a mixture of tallow pine pitch to slow the entry of moisture. Above the plenum, she laid the floor. She had come so close to losing 10 of her 20 planks, tongued, grooved as well as she could manage with a chisel, a mallet, a patience she had not known she owned. At one end of the floor, directly above the plenum, she cut a small grated opening. At the far end of the shack near the base of the north wall, she cut a second smaller vent. The colder, heavier air of the cabin's interior would be pushed out through that second vent. The steadier air of the earth would rise through the first. A slow circle, a breathing, a hearth without a fire. She spent a full week on the shell of the shack itself. She cut sod bricks from the tough prairie grass on the flat below the ridge, thick as her forearm, heavy as small children. She stacked them against the outside of every wall, banking them up to the eaves so that from a distance the shack disappeared into what looked like a natural mound. She chinked every gap between the wall planks with a paste she made from creek clay, dry grass, working the mixture in with her thumbs until her nails bled. The gap disappeared. She patched the roof with flattened scraps of tin from an abandoned prospector's dump a half-mile up the trail. She sealed the seams with pine pitch she rendered on her own little stove. On the second day of December, when the first true snow of the season began to fall in earnest straight down thick, she stood inside the transformed shack. She looked around at what she had made. She felt for the first time in almost 2 months something in her chest that was not fear. It was too small to be called pride. It was closer to recognition. She had made a place. The first real test came a week later on the 10th of December when the mercury in Halloran's window slumped to 10 below zero at dawn. Stayed there through the morning. Up in the town, the plank houses on Main Street streamed white smoke straight up into the still air inside them. The floors turned to ice. The drafts crept in around every window, every door. The people stoked their stoves higher, watched their wood piles shrink. Down at the shack by Kettle Brook, a single small fire in Elias's cast iron stove kept the interior at 55 degrees. The greater miracle was the floor. She knelt on it that morning in a shaft of pale gray light. She pressed her palm flat against the pine. The wood was cool to the touch. It was not the cool of a chilled thing that was reaching after her warmth. It was a living cool beneath it. When she held her hand very still, she could feel the faintest current of air rising through the grated opening at her knee. Air that was not warm, not cold. Air that was 38 degrees when the world outside was 48 degrees, colder than that air that had come to her out of the deep ground through a channel of stone she had built with her own bloody hands. She sat back on her heels. She did not cry, but she came closer to it than she had come since October. That night she wrote for the first time in the back of her grandmother's book, in the pale space Delphia had left after her last recipe. She wrote in a small, careful hand, the hand of a woman aware that what she was writing might one day be read by someone who was not yet born. The earth kept its word, she wrote. The floor did not freeze. She looked at the sentence for a long time. Then she closed the book, set it on the small pine shelf she had built for it above the stove. She banked the fire. She blew out the lantern. She lay down on her bedroll in the quiet warmth of a shack the town had already buried. She slept. Up in Hollowford Bend that same night in the warm parlor of the biggest house on Main Street, Barnaby Thorne stood at his window with a glass of rye in his hand, watched the smoke of the town go straight up into a black, windless sky. I was thinking in a small, distracted way about the Halloway girl. He had heard from Rennick 2 weeks ago that she was still down there, still digging, that she had gone half feral in the head with grief, hard work. He had felt when Rennick told him this a mild professional regret of the sort a banker feels when a loan he has written off turns out to be more embarrassingly dead than he had hoped. He tapped his glass against the cold pane. Poor thing, he said to no one in particular. He thought no more about her. He went to bed in a house whose foundation stones went 4 feet deep into ground that would soon be frozen to 7. He slept the sleep of a man who had never in his life been wrong about anything important outside his window, far up above the ridge where the peaks caught the last cold starlight. Something was beginning to gather that was going to teach the entire town in 1 week that would be remembered for 100 years. Years, the price of what they had refused to learn from a 19-year-old widow with dirt under her nails. The morning after the mercury sank to 10 below, Merritt woke to a silence so complete she thought for a bad moment that she had gone deaf in the night. There was no wind, there was no creak of the walls. The only sound was the small tick of the stove settling in its own iron, a private conversation between metal cold. She lay still on the bedroll with the wool of Elias's old work coat pulled up to her chin, listening past the silence for the thing beneath it, the slow, steady breath rising through the grated opening near her cot. It was there. Faint as a sleeping child's breath, but there. She let herself lie in it for a full minute before she rose. That minute was the closest thing to prayer she had allowed herself since the burial. She opened the door of the shack to a world remade in white. The snow that had begun the previous afternoon had gone on through the night without sound, without violence, laying itself down in a thickness of nearly 2 feet across the flat by the creek. The willows along the bank were bowed to the water. The mound of her buried trench had disappeared entirely, become one soft ridge among many indistinguishable now from any other roll of the ground. That pleased her in a way she had not expected. The country had accepted her work. It had drawn a blanket over it, made it part of itself. She spent the morning at small, careful chores that a woman with a proper household would not have thought of as chores at all. She swept the fresh snow off the roof with a bundle of willow switches lashed to a broom handle because a weight of snow on a patched roof was a slow way to lose a winter. She checked the wire snares along the willow runs, found nothing which she had expected because rabbits did not travel much in the first hard cold. She broke the skin of ice at the edge of Kettle Brook with the heel of a stone, dipped a bucket of water from the black moving center. She carried the bucket back to the shack without spilling because spilled water on a walking path became a small killing ambush by nightfall. She noticed all of these things the way a person notices the parts of a language she has only recently begun to speak. She was learning to be spoken to by the ground. By afternoon, the sun came out thin yellow without weight. She stood in the doorway with a tin cup of hot water pressed to her lower lip. She watched the smoke of Hollowford Bend rise straight up above the ridge, more smoke than she had ever seen from the town on a single afternoon. There were columns going up from every chimney, some of them thick dark, some of them the pale color that meant seasoned oak burned too hot, all of them wasteful, all of them the smoke of people fighting the cold. The only way they knew, which was to feed a stove until the stove ate more than the winter could give back. She counted the columns. She stopped counting at 22. Somewhere in that count was the chimney of Barnaby Thorne, somewhere the chimney of the Reverend Whitlock, somewhere the chimney of Cyrus Rennick. She felt no satisfaction in the counting, only a mild, distant curiosity about which of the three would run out of wood first. The days after the first hard cold settled into a rhythm. She rose at first gray light. She fed a small fire in the stove, the size of a fire she would have used to warm soup rather than a room, because the room was already warm enough for work, if not for sitting. She melted snow for water, washed her face. Her hands, she braided her hair back tight. She ate a piece of the flat cornbread she had learned to bake on top of the stove, in a lidded pan. She drank a cup of a bitter tea made from the last of the sassafras roots she had dug in October. She read 3 pages of her grandmother's book each morning, no more, no less. The book was small, the winter was long, she meant to make them come out even. She had begun in the second week of December to write in the book herself. Not much. A line at the end of each day in the smallest hand she could manage, so that Delphia's spidery script, her own straight upright letters, would not crowd each other. The cold on the 15th was 15 below. The floor held at 39. Small entries without adornment. She was aware as she wrote them that she was doing something her grandmother had done, her grandmother's mother before her, which was to keep a private ledger of how the earth had behaved. She was also aware that no one else in Hollowford Bend was keeping such a ledger, because no one else in Hollowford Bend believed there was anything to record. On the 22nd of December, she saw her first human face in 3 weeks. It belonged to a boy of about 11, thin as a fence rail, with a wool cap pulled down over ears the color of raw meat. He came around the bend of the trail from town at a half-run, saw the smoke from her stovepipe rising thin against the ridge, stopped dead in the middle of the trail, stared at the shack as though it had grown out of the ground overnight. She stood in the doorway with the door only half open. She watched him watch her. His mouth was slightly open. His breath came out in small white bursts. She recognized him after a moment as the youngest son of a family that lived at the far south end of Main Street, a family named Lark, whose father was a wheelwright. She had seen the boy once or twice at church, back when she still went to church, back before the pews had become an audience for her humiliation. She lifted her hand to him, a small, sober gesture, neither welcome nor warning. After a long, uncertain moment, he lifted his own hand back. Then he turned, ran back up the trail toward town, at the same half-run he had come down. She watched him go with a small, unwelcome tightening in her chest. The town was going to know she was alive. The town was going to have to decide what to do with that information. The information traveled fast. She heard it 2 days later from a different source. An old trapper named Otho Beach, who lived in a dugout up on Copper Ridge, came down to the creek every few weeks to check his own snare line. Beach was a man of about 60 with a face like a walnut, a habit of speaking to himself when he thought no one was listening. He had been kind to Elias in a distant, unsentimental way for as long as Elias had been alive. He appeared on her trail on Christmas Eve morning with a small bundle in one gloved hand, cleared his throat from 20 feet out so as not to startle her, stopped at a respectful distance from the door. "Miss Halloway." He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, a gesture from an older country. "I brung you a piece of elk. It ain't much. Was a young cow took her yesterday up the North Fork. I figured you might could use it." She looked at the bundle. It was wrapped in a scrap of clean oilcloth. It was easily 5 pounds of good backstrap, more meat than she had seen at one time in 3 months. She looked at Beach's face. She understood in a single glance that he was not offering charity, because Otho Beach would have died before offering charity to a widow. He knew that she knew he knew. He was offering a gift between 2 people who lived by the same water. "I thank you, Mr. Beach. I have some cornbread. Come inside a minute. The cold will thin you out on the walk back." He hesitated. He looked past her into the doorway. She watched his eyes take in what a man who had spent 40 winters in the mountains would take in about the interior of her shack. She watched his eyebrows lift just perceptibly once. He stepped inside. He removed his hat. He stood in the middle of the room, turned slowly the way a man turns in a place he does not entirely understand. He did not speak for the better part of a minute. He crossed the floor, stopped over the grated opening near the north wall. He crouched. He set the flat of his palm on the pine floor, held it there, closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked up at her with an expression she had not seen on any face since her wedding. It was not admiration. It was recognition. It was the look of one craftsman finding another where he had not expected to. "You dug you a warm channel. Old woman's work. Where did you learn it?" "From my grandmother." "Blue Ridge. Ridge people." He nodded once slowly. He straightened. "My mother's people was from the Cumberland. Same idea, different country. Never seen one done under a shack this small. Most times it's under a barn, keep the animals from freezing." He looked at her again with that steady, weathered gaze. "You done this alone?" "Yes." He was silent for a moment. Then, without looking at her, he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "The town don't know what they threw away, Miss Halloway." She did not answer. There was no answer. He put his hat back on. He accepted a small square of the cornbread, which he ate in 2 bites while standing. He refused the offer of hot water because he was already sweating in the warmth of the shack, which said more about the shack than any thermometer could. Before he left, he stood in the open doorway, looked back at her. Once he said quietly, "Come the spring, if you find yourself needing an extra pair of hands, you send word up to Copper Ridge. I owe your grandfather something from a long time back that I never got to pay off proper." He was gone up the trail, a small dark figure against the white. She stood in the doorway for a long time after he had gone. The elk lay on the table behind her, a red generosity she had not known how much she needed until it was in front of her. She had not realized until Beach spoke how alone she had been. She had not realized how much of her strength had gone into pretending, even to herself, that alone was a thing a person could stay indefinitely. His single sentence about the town had done a small, dangerous thing inside her chest. It had cracked something open. She stood in the doorway until the cold began to find its way through the wool of her sleeves. Then she went back inside. She cut the elk into strips for smoking, because grief, gratitude were both real, but neither of them would keep meat. Up in Hollowford Bend, the story of the Halloway girl still being alive was doing its own quiet work. It reached Barnaby Thorne on Christmas morning, delivered by his wife Adeline, over a breakfast of ham biscuits in a dining room where the floorboards near the outside wall had already begun to sweat frost during the night. Adeline was a stout, pleasant woman who had spent 22 years learning when to speak to her husband, when to let a silence do her speaking. She chose this morning to speak. "Barnaby, the Lark boy saw smoke from her chimney 3 days ago." Thorne buttered a biscuit with the small, precise motions he used for every task involving his hands. "Whose chimney?" "The Halloway girl, down at the creek." He set the knife down. He looked at his wife across the table for the length of a slow breath. "That is not possible, Adeline." He said it quietly, the way a man corrects a child who has confused 2 similar words. "She has no wood laid up. She has no proper stove. She has been down there without help since October. It is not possible she is still in that shack. Adeline poured herself a second cup of coffee. Nevertheless, Thorne did not answer at once. His mind, which had been trained by 20 years of banking to reduce every human situation to a small number of movable pieces, moved the pieces. If the girl was alive, then she was not a closed account, which was the way he had preferred to think of her. If the girl was alive, had somehow contrived to keep herself alive in a shack that no sensible person believed capable of shelter, then something had happened in his ledger that he had not authorized. He did not like transactions he had not authorized. He picked up the biscuit, he ate it. He said without looking at his wife, "If she comes into town, I do not want a scene." She said mildly, "No one is planning a scene, Barnaby." He said good. He did not eat a second biscuit. Reverend Whitlock heard the news on the same morning from his housekeeper, a widow of about 50 named Eulalie Doss, whose husband had died in the same timber crew accident that had taken Elias Halloway. Eulalie had not gone soft in her widowhood. She had gone hard in the way certain women go hard, which is inside where the softness had been. She served the Reverend his oatmeal without a word. She stood at the sideboard while he ate. She said, without turning around, "That Halloway girl is still down at the creek." He looked up. He set his spoon down. "She is." "Yes, she is." He wiped his mouth with a napkin. He composed his face the way he composed it before a funeral. "Well, that is a small mercy. We shall have to send someone down to check on her welfare after the new year." Eulalie turned around then. She was a small woman. Her hands were red from the cold water in the wash basin. She looked at the Reverend across the room, the way a person looks at a wall she has just decided to walk through. "Reverend." He blinked. "Yes, Eulalie. She did not survive on our welfare. She survived without it. There is a difference." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He had been a minister for 31 years. He had learned in that time to identify the moments when speech would cost him more than silence. This was one of them. Eulalie turned back to the sideboard. She began without further comment to polish a silver spoon that had not needed polishing. The Reverend finished his oatmeal in a silence that felt slightly warmer than the room around him. He did not know why. He did not want to know why. He told himself as he rose from the table that Eulalie was overwrought because of the season. The news reached Cyrus Rennick on the 26th, delivered without ceremony by his own son Wesley, a boy of 9 with his father's serious eyes. Wesley had been down at the mercantile helping Halloran stack flour sacks. In exchange for a peppermint stick, he had heard 2 of the older men talking at the Cracker Barrel about the widow at the creek. One of the men had said more with wonder than with malice, "That girl has a devil in her keeping alive down there, in a shack made of holes." Wesley had said nothing at the time because his father had raised him not to speak into the conversations of grown men. But he had come home. He had waited until his father was cleaning his tools at the workbench in the back shed. Then he had told him. Rennick did not speak while Wesley spoke. He kept oiling the same chisel with the same rag in long, slow strokes until Wesley was finished. Then he said, "Thank you, son. Go help your mother with the wood." Wesley went. Rennick sat down on the low stool at the end of his workbench. He stared at the chisel in his hand. He thought about a young widow standing in a pit up to her chest, in her own dug earth. He thought about the word he had used to describe her work, which had been the word folly. He thought about the fact that his own house at that moment had a floor that made his son's feet ache to walk across in the mornings. He thought about Elias. Elias had been more than friends. They had been the closest thing to family either of them had had out here, in a country where family was mostly what a man built out of the people who happened to be within a day's ride. Rennick had known Elias since Elias was 15. He had helped him buy his first axe. He had stood up at his wedding to the small, quiet, gray-eyed girl who had come out from Virginia with her grandfather to keep house for a great-uncle who had died the same year she arrived. When Elias had been carried out of the timber on a plank 6 weeks after his second wedding anniversary, Rennick had been the man who told the widow. He had told her badly. He knew he had told her badly. He had stood in the doorway of the cabin the town had since taken from her. He had said, "Miss Halloway, Elias is gone." He had not gone inside because he had not trusted himself to. He had left her standing there with the door open behind her alone in a kitchen where a pot of beans was still simmering for a supper that was not going to be eaten. He had walked back to town without looking behind him once. He had told himself at the time that a man made a poor comforter of women, that a decent widow's neighbors would be along shortly to do what was needed. He knew now, sitting on the low stool with an oiled chisel in his hand, that what he had actually done was run. The judgment in the town hall had been a second running. He had known when Thorne read the numbers that the numbers were dishonest. A cabin 160 acres of good creek bottom were worth more than $15. Everyone in the room had known it. He had sat at the end of the table, looked at a knot in the pine floor. Let it happen, because saying otherwise would have cost him something with Thorne, with the reverend he had not been willing to pay. The visit to the shack in November had been the third running, though he had told himself at the time it was a kindness. He had gone down with the reverend, meaning to talk her out of her strange labor before she killed herself with it. What he had actually done was insult her dead husband's memory, use it as a weapon. He had walked out of that shack. He had not spoken about her again to anyone for 6 weeks. He set the chisel down on the bench. He put his face in his hands. He was 51 years old. He had built more than 60 houses in this valley. He sat in the back shed of the largest, best built of them. With his face in his hands, he understood for perhaps the first time in his adult life that a man could be right about woodstone joinery, all his days still be wrong about the only thing that mattered, which was another human being. He sat like that for a long time. When he finally lifted his face, he did not go back into the house. He went into the shop. He took down from a high shelf a small tin box in which he kept a private, slowly growing collection of money that his wife did not know about. He counted out $11 in coin-folded bills. He put the money in an envelope. He wrote on the envelope in his careful builder's hand the words, "For Miss Halloway, from a friend of Elias." He sealed it. I did not deliver it. He put it in the drawer of his workbench. He stood looking at the drawer for a long moment. He thought, when the thaw comes. When the thaw comes, I can look her in the face without shame. Down at the shack that same afternoon, Merritt was doing something she had not done since her wedding, which was to make a full accounting of her stores. She spread every scrap of food she owned across the pine table she had built from 4 of her floor planks. There was flour, about 6 pounds of it, in a canvas sack that had once held meal. There was cornmeal, closer to 9 pounds. There were dry beans, most of a small crock, perhaps 8 cups. There was salt sugar, a jar of lard she had rendered from the fat of a groundhog Otho had brought her a week after the elk. There was the elk itself, most of 5 pounds of it now smoked dark on the string she had hung across the rafters. There were 3 onions from the creek bank, wrinkling but sound. There were the last dry twists of sassafras. There was, she calculated slowly with a small stub of pencil on a scrap of the wrapping paper. The pine had come in about 7 weeks of careful eating. If the snares kept producing, the smoked elk did not go off, which meant she would come out of the winter thin but standing. She wrote the number 7 on the paper. She looked at it. Something moved in her that she had been keeping at bay for a long time. It was not fear. Fear had gone somewhere else in her weeks ago, the way certain feelings do when they discover they are not being useful. What moved in her was the recognition that she was going to live through this, that she had in fact already lived through it in the only sense that mattered, which was the mathematical sense. The winter was going to be long. It was going to be cruel to the town above her, but it was not going to kill her. She was not going to give her death to those 3 men, their table. She was going to give them instead something they would not have known how to ask for, would not thank her for having given, which was the sight of her still standing when the thaw came. She wrote a second thing on the paper in smaller letters underneath the 7. The debt is paid. She looked at it for a long time. She was not sure whose debt she meant. She was not sure it mattered. She folded the paper. She put it in the back of her grandmother's book, between the last of Delphia's recipes, the first of her own entries. She closed the book. She went outside to bring in the night's wood. New Year's Eve came in with a wind that howled around the ridges but did not quite reach the flat by the creek. She spent it as she had spent every night since October, alone, warm reading by the light of the smallest lamp flame she could manage. She read the story of Ruth that night because it was the only book of scripture she had ever cared for. She read it with a new understanding that made the old story unfamiliar again. She had always thought Ruth was a story about loyalty. She saw for the first time that night that it was a story about a woman with no options who kept walking anyway. She fell asleep with the book open on her chest. She woke to the first day of 1884 with the taste of cornmeal in her mouth, the sound of Kettle Brook running black beneath its skin of ice. The first 2 weeks of January brought a stretch of dry, hard weather that the whole valley began to relax into. The mercury sat between 0–10 below, at dawn climbed to 15 or 20 above by afternoon. While no one would have called such weather kind, It was whether a Colorado town could handle if the woodpiles held. Woodpiles began to be a topic of conversation in Halloran's mercantile in a way they had not been in November or December. Woodpiles, the price of coal at the depot down in Durango, which had gone up by half in the space of a week. The fact that the freight sled from Silverton had not come through on the 15th or the 16th. Nothing to worry about, said the men at the Cracker Barrel. A delay, the pass. But they said it more often than they had needed to say it in previous winters. Each time one of them said it, the others nodded a little too quickly. On the 17th of January, a Wednesday, the sky began to do something that even the old-timers of Hollowford Bend had not seen before. It did not gather clouds. It thinned. All morning the blue went pale, then paler, then a strange wash color that was not gray, not white, a color like the inside of a shell. The peaks disappeared into it. The ridges disappeared. Halloran, standing on his porch at noon, with a hand shading his eyes against a light that gave no warmth, said quietly to no one in particular, "That ain't right." Otho Beach, who had come down from Copper Ridge that morning to trade 3 fox pelts for tobacco, stood beside him, did not answer at once. Then he said, "Going to be a bad one, Halloran. You get your wife inside, you tie a rope from your porch to the woodshed before dark." Halloran laughed uneasily. "Come now, Otho. It's just going to snow." Otho spat off the edge of the porch into the trampled snow. "That ain't snow coming," he said. "That's the whole sky letting go at once." Down at the shack, Merritt saw the same pale sky at about the same moment through the small grease paper window she had fitted into the wall where the old broken sash had been. She did not know the color. She had never seen it. But she watched it for a long moment with her hands still in the dishwater. She felt a small cold thing settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water. Her grandmother had a phrase for weather that did not fit any of the ordinary names. Delphia had called it a mouth. A mouth of the sky, she had said, is a sky that has been quiet too long, means to speak. Merritt dried her hands on her apron. She went outside without her shawl. She stood in the yard. She looked up. There was no wind. The willows along Kettle Brook were absolutely still, each bare branch bright against the pale sky like ink lines drawn on paper. The smoke from her stovepipe rose straight up for perhaps 4 feet, then flattened out sideways all at once in a layer, as though it had struck an invisible ceiling. That was the thing she had never seen before. She had seen still air. She had seen a temperature inversion. She had not seen the two together with a sky the color of the inside of a shell. She stood in the yard for a full minute, watching her own smoke lie down flat in the air above her stovepipe. She thought in the exact words her grandmother would have used. "The sky has a mouth on it today." She went back inside. She did what a woman who has been made ready by a hard autumn does when she sees a sky she does not recognize. She did not panic. She did not run. She went through the shack one task at a time. She made it more ready than it already was. She brought in twice the wood she would ordinarily bring in for a night, stacked it neatly along the wall behind the stove, filled the wood box, filled a second box she had built out of scrap. She melted an extra bucket of snow, set the water on the stove to keep from freezing. She took the smoked elk down from the rafters, moved it into a smaller, drier corner where the air would not touch it as much. She checked the chinking on the north wall, pressed a fresh handful of clay into a hairline gap she had not previously noticed. She unrolled a second blanket she had been saving. She did all of this without hurry in the middle of an afternoon in which the light did not change, the wind did not blow. The whole time she worked, she was aware in a low, steady way that the country outside her door was gathering itself for something. The first pellet struck the window at 4 o'clock. Not a flake. A pellet small, hard as a grain of buckshot, that hit the greased paper with a dry tick slid down. Then a second. Then 100. Within 10 minutes, the air outside was full of a sound she had never heard before, a fine, dry hissing, as though the sky were pouring sand across the roof of her shack. The pellets did not fall straight. They came in almost horizontally, driven by a wind that had risen out of the north without warning, without any of the ordinary announcement inside of a quarter of an hour. The flat by the creek was invisible from the doorway. She could see when she cracked the door to look perhaps 10 feet. The willows had gone. The creek had gone. The trail had gone. The world had been reduced to a swirling white noise, the color of the pale sky, which had produced it, the mercury which she had hung on a nail outside the north wall in October, which she now brought inside for the first time all winter, read 17 below dropping. She closed the door. She threw the small wooden bar across it. She banked the fire down to a slow, steady red because a hot fire in a shack this tight was a fire that would run through her wood in one night. She sat down at the pine table with her grandmother's book in front of her. She did not open it. She listened. The sound the storm made was not the sound of any storm she had grown up in. The Virginia storms of her childhood had been wet, noisy things, all thunder downpour over in a night. The Colorado storms of her married years had been wind-driven cold, but human somehow storms a person could argue with. This was not a storm a person could argue with. This was a piece of country that had opened its mouth exactly as Delphia had said. What came out of the mouth was a killing intention, patient, impersonal, that meant to erase every soft, warm-blooded thing above the ground in this valley by the simple mathematics of subtraction. Up in Hollowford Bend, the same storm hit the town half an hour after it hit the shack because the flat by the creek lay a little to the north caught it first. It hit the town harder because the town was not ready. Halloran had gotten his rope tied. Otho had made it out of Halloran's back door, gotten to his own horse, gotten 100 yards up the trail toward Copper Ridge, turned around when he realized he could not see the ground. He had barely gotten back to Halloran's before the visibility failed entirely. I would spend the next 4 days in the small back room behind the mercantile with the Halloran family, feeding a stove that ate wood twice as fast as it should have because the wind was pulling the heat straight up the pipe out into the roaring dark. But he was one of the few who had read the sky in time. The others had not. In the large two-story house on Main Street, Adeline Thorne had put a roast in the oven at 3 o'clock, expecting company at 6. By 5 o'clock, she was standing in the doorway of the parlor, with the front door blown open behind her, the roast forgotten, watching her husband try to nail a blanket over a window whose glass had cracked from the sudden cold. The 2 children, a girl of 7 named Prudence, a boy of 4 named Thomas, stood clutching each other in the middle of the parlor rug, staring at the open front door with the wide, unblinking eyes of children who understand without having the words for it that something is happening that the grown-ups did not plan for. Adeline gathered them to her without thinking. She wrapped them in the shawl she had put on to greet company. She took them up the stairs to the smallest bedroom on the second floor, the one with the fewest windows. She sat on the bed with them in her arms while her husband down below began the wrong argument with a storm. In the parsonage across the square, Reverend Whitlock stood in his own front room with a hymnal in one hand, no idea what to do with it. His wife Cordelia, a thin, quiet woman who had suffered from a weakness of the lungs since the fall, was already in bed on the second floor. The sound of her breathing through the open bedroom door had a wet edge to it that he had been pretending for a week not to hear. Eulalie Doss stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, her mouth set in a hard line when the Reverend turned to her with the hymnal still in his hand, opened his mouth to ask her what she thought they should do. She said before he could get the question out, "We need more wood, Reverend. Reverend, if you have not brought it in from the shed by now, you will need to bring it in through a wind that will take the skin off your face. So bring it in. I will boil water for tea for Mrs. Whitlock." The Reverend closed his mouth. He set the hymnal down on the sideboard. He put on his heavy coat. He went out into the storm to bring in wood. He understood as he stepped off the porch into a wall of pellets that struck his cheeks like sand, stole the breath from his mouth that he had spent the last 3 months mistaking his housekeeper for a servant. In the master carpenter's house at the north end of Main Street, Cyrus Rennick did not need to be told what to do. He had brought in the wood at noon. He had brought in a second load at 2. He had tied the rope from the porch to the woodshed at 3 before the pellets began. Because he had watched the sky do its shell-colored trick, he had trusted what his own eyes were telling him. His wife Ida, a broad, calm woman who had been married to him for 26 years, moved around the kitchen with the efficient certainty of a person who had grown up in a country where weather was the only real government. Their son Wesley sat at the kitchen table with a slate, a piece of the chalk, working on his letters, because Ida had decided that the storm was not going to be allowed to interrupt his schooling. Wesley had not argued because he did not argue with his mother. They were of all the families in Hollowford Bend that afternoon the readiest. They had wood for a week. They had a stove that drew well. They had a house that Cyrus had built with his own hands out of the tightest joinery in the valley. It was into this house at about 7 o'clock in the evening of the first day of the storm that the first small, terrible truth began to enter. The floor near the north wall of the kitchen, the wall that faced the direction the wind was coming from, began to grow a fine layer of frost on its underside that Cyrus discovered when he set his boot down, heard a crackle like paper. He crouched. He touched the wood. It was not merely cold. it was frozen. The floorboards of his own kitchen, which he had planned, fitted himself in. 1879 had been overtaken from below by the ground he had built them on. He stayed crouched for a long moment with his hand on the frozen board. He did not look up at his wife because his wife had known him long enough to read a face he did not want to be read yet. He was thinking about the widow at the creek. He was thinking about a hole in the ground he had called folly. He was thinking about the envelope in the drawer of his workbench that said in his own hand for Miss Halloway, from a friend of Elias, how the money in the envelope was not going to matter if the wind outside did what he was beginning to suspect it meant to do. He straightened slowly. He walked to the window. He put his palm against the glass. The glass was so cold it burned. He turned back to Ida, he said quietly, so Wesley would not hear. "We may have a hard few days ahead, Ida. Feed the fire lower than you want to. We are going to need every stick of it." Ida did not answer at once. She looked at him across the kitchen the way she had been looking at him for 26 years, which was as though she had seen him more clearly than he had ever seen himself. She said only, "All right, Cyrus." She opened the stove. She fed it exactly one small piece of pine. Outside in the roaring dark, the storm that would be remembered for the next 100 years, as the long white silence had only just cleared its throat. The second night of the storm was the night the town began to lose things it had assumed it would never lose. Not lives yet, small things. A pane of glass in the Halloran back kitchen let go at about 2 in the morning with a sound like a dropped teacup. The wind that came through the empty frame within 30 seconds coated the flour barrel in the corner with a fine crust of ice. A woodshed door at the far south end of Main Street tore free of its top hinge, hammered against the shed wall, until the hammering woke every family within 100 yards, none of whom dared step outside to fix it. The bell rope on the church, frozen stiff, at first worked loose in the wind. The bell in the little steeple gave out 3 slow tolls at some black hour before dawn. Unattended, unrequested sounding for no funeral anyone had yet arranged. Inside the master carpenter's house at the north end of the street, Cyrus Rennick sat at his kitchen table in the small red light of a stove. He had been feeding one stick every 40 minutes. He watched the frost creep across the kitchen floor. It moved. That was the thing he could not stop watching. It moved the way a slow tide moves on a flat beach, a quarter of an inch at a time, taking the floor from him board by board. By first light on the 18th of January, the frost had reached the leg of the kitchen table where he was sitting. He set his boot against the leg. He could feel the cold coming up through the sole. Ida had gone up to bed with Wesley at midnight, both of them wrapped in every wool blanket the house contained, sharing the one small chamber whose stovepipe from the kitchen ran up through the floor to a metal collar that gave off a little residual warmth. Cyrus had told them to sleep. He had told them he would keep the fire. He had not told them the truth, which was that he had begun to be afraid in a way he had not been afraid in his adult life, that his fear was not of the cold itself, but of what he had built. Every joint in the house was tight. Every board was true. He had put this house up with his own hands. It was, he now understood, a beautifully made object designed for the wrong problem. It kept the wind out. It did not keep the ground from reaching in. He had walked the perimeter of the downstairs 3 times in the night. Each time he had put his palm against a different section of floor near the outside wall. Each time the wood had been colder than the time before. The stove was drawing well. The stove was doing its work. The stove was warming a 2-foot band of air at head height in the kitchen, nothing else. The floor was a slab of ice under a thin skin of pine. The cold at ankle height was a killing cold. Wesley was upstairs sleeping in his mother's arms because the upstairs was 10 degrees warmer than the downstairs, by the simple physics that heat rises. Cyrus understood, sitting alone at the kitchen table, watching frost take his own house from him, that a father who cannot warm his own son's feet in his own kitchen has been wrong about something more important than joinery. He got up. He fed the stove a stick. He crossed to the window, scraped a small circle in the frost on the inside of the glass. With the ball of his thumb looked out. The storm was still going. He could not see the house across the street. He could not see the porch railing 4 feet from the window. What he could see was a swirling gray-white that had no depth to it, no reference points, no sense that a world existed on the other side of the yard. In that swirling nothing at the very edge of what he could resolve, he thought he saw a column of smoke. Not straight up, not even flattened sideways the way his own smoke was flattening. This was a thin, faint column that appeared to be coming from the direction of Kettle Brook. It was rising in the storm in a way that suggested a fire that was being fed, tended by someone who was still alive. He stood at the window for a long time. He knew he could be imagining it. Grief cold made a man see things. He also knew the direction was exact. He also knew Otho Beach had said 3 days before, in a phrase Halloran had passed on to him in the mercantile, that the girl had put a hole in the ground the way ridge people used to put them in, that the town did not know what they had thrown away. That phrase had been sitting under Cyrus's ribs like a splinter for 3 days. He turned from the window. He went to the shelf where Ida kept the coffee. I took down the tin. He counted out the last of the beans into a small paper twist, tied it with a piece of string. He did not know why he was doing it. He put the twist in his coat pocket. He put on the coat, the second coat over it, the wool comforter around his neck twice. He took down from the peg by the door his heaviest gloves. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his gloves in his hand. He stared at the frost on his own floor. He understood without dressing it up in any better language, that if he stayed in this house another 12 hours, he would watch the cold reach his son. Ida. He said it quietly. He said it again a little louder. He heard her come to the top of the stairs. He heard her stop there because she had a good ear for the sound of a man who had already decided something. Cyrus, I am going out. He heard the small, indrawn breath. He did not let her speak. I think there is smoke down at the creek. I think the Halloway girl is still keeping a fire. I am going to go see what she has done. If I am right, I am coming back for you for Wesley. Do not let the stove go out. Do not open the front door for anyone but me. Cyrus Rennick, you cannot see 6 feet. You will die within 100 yards. He looked up the stairs at his wife, her gray hair loose around her face. One hand on the banister, he said the thing he had been rehearsing in his head since he had watched the frost cross the kitchen. If I stay, Ida, we will all die in a house I built. If I go, one of us might get through this. It is not much of a choice, but it is the one I have. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, take the long clothesline from the pantry. Tie it to the porch post. Do not let go of it. Do you hear me? Do not let go of it, Cyrus. He heard her. He took the clothesline. It was manila rope, 30 yards of it, thicker than he needed, heavier than he wanted, but it was what he had. He tied one end around the porch post with the double bowline he had used to tie 100 scaffolds in his life. He wrapped the loose coil over his shoulder. He opened the front door. The wind hit him like an open-handed slap from a bigger man than he had ever fought. He stepped down off the porch into snow that came to his knee, then to his thigh, then to his waist as he waded away from the house. Within 10 paces, he could not see the house behind him. Within 20, he could not see the rope in his own gloved hand except by feel. He turned into the wind, put his head down, began to walk in the direction he had chosen before he stepped off the porch. Because in the whiteout, the only direction he had was the one he had committed to before the whiteout began. The half-mile from his front porch to the flat by Kettle Brook took him nearly 2 hours. He fell 9 times. He lost the rope twice, both times only for the space of a heartbeat, both times finding it again by the sheer accident of his own gloved hand, closing on the manila as it snaked across the snow beside him. He drifted off the trail 3 times, had to correct, by feeling the slope of the ground under his boots, because a Colorado logger who has walked a piece of country for 20 years develops an idiot animal memory for its rise-fall that will work even when his eyes are useless. His face went numb in stages, first the tip of his nose, then his cheekbones, then the flesh above his beard. By the time he reached the last downhill pitch toward the creek, he could not feel his own mouth well enough to be sure it was closed. He kept walking because to stop was to die. He was not going to die within sight of a widow whose husband he had failed. He did not see the shack. He walked into it. His outstretched glove struck something soft, thick, slightly yielding for a stupid, disoriented moment. He thought he had walked into a haystack. Then his glove sank in. He felt beneath the soft surface layer of drifted snow, the hard mounded structure of packed sod. He understood at once what he was touching, because he had passed the shack 100 times in daylight, had never in his life mistaken it for anything but a ruin. He turned to his right, feeling his way along the wall by the pressure of his shoulder. He found the eave. He found the door half buried under a drift that had piled against it in the shape of a slow white wave. He shoveled the drift away with the flat of his gloves. He set his shoulder to the door. It gave inward sudden as a held breath. He fell through the doorway onto his hands' knees. He pulled the door shut behind him with the last honest strength in his right arm. He pushed the wooden bar across it with fingers that could no longer feel the bar. Then he stayed on his hands-knees on the pine floor of the shack because his legs would not yet consent to lift him. He heard for the first time in 8 hours silence, not the flat silence of the storm's absence. A deep, enveloping silence, the sound of a room whose walls were thick enough to make the wind outside into a distant rumor. Under the silence he heard other things, the tick of a small iron stove settling, the soft in out of a person breathing, the barely audible whisper of air moving through a grate. He lifted his face. Merritt Halloway sat in a straight-back chair by the stove, wrapped in a shawl the color of dried moss, a small leather-bound book open on her lap. She was not startled. She had heard him coming, he understood in a slow way from the moment he had begun to fumble at the door. She had waited for whatever came through it. She looked at him without smiling, without alarm. Her face in the small yellow light of the single candle on the table was thinner than he remembered, steadier than he remembered, older by more than 3 months. "Mr. Rennick, sit by the stove. Do not take the gloves off yet. Let your hands come back slow or you will lose fingers." He tried to speak. His mouth would not work. He nodded. He crawled the 4 feet to the stove on his hands-knees. Because standing was still beyond him, he sat down heavily on the floor with his back against the wood box she had built out of scrap. She did not rise. She did not fuss. She closed the book, marked her place with a strip of red cloth, set the book on the pine table beside the candle. Only then did she rise, cross to the stove to pour hot water into a tin cup from a kettle that had been keeping itself just below a boil for hours. She wrapped his gloved hands around the cup without removing the gloves. She did not speak while she did it. She was performing the small, precise ministrations of a person who had been thinking about frostbite as a practical matter for months, not the fluttering care of a woman surprised in her home. She left him with the cup. She went to a peg on the wall, took down a heavy wool blanket. She draped it over his shoulders. Only when she had done all of that did she sit back down in the straight-back chair opposite him. Let him look at what he had come to see. He looked. His eyes were still watering from the cold. The small yellow candle made the shadows deep, but he had spent his whole working life looking at rooms, reading them. He read this one now the way another man might have read a page of scripture. He saw the pine floor, unadorned, well-fitted. He saw the small grate near his own boots. He saw the second smaller vent near the base of the north wall. He saw the sod walls where the chinking had been done, not with the usual crude gray putty of a Colorado shack, but with a smoother, darker mixture in which he could see fine threads of dried grass. He saw the way the ceiling boards had been fitted, not perfectly, but competently, by someone who had learned to hold a chisel without being taught. He saw all of it in perhaps 10 seconds. Then he set the cup down very carefully on the floor beside his knee. He removed one glove slowly. He put his bare palm flat against the pine floor. The floor was cool. He had expected cold. He had walked half a mile through air that would kill a man in 10 minutes of exposure. The floor of the shack he had condemned 3 months ago was cool. Not warm, cool. He could feel when he held his hand very still. A slow, patient current of air rising through the grate, an arm's length from his knee. A current perhaps 20 degrees warmer than any air currently existing on the outside of the shack. An air that carried the mineral smell of stone, the faint green smell of wet earth. He kept his hand on the floor for a long time. He realized without warning, weeping. The tears were not doing anything useful because his beard was still frozen. The tears were freezing in it as they came, but they were coming. He did not stop them. "How?" The word came out cracked. He tried again. "How did you do this?" She looked at him across the small, warm room, across the space between a straight chair, a stove, across 3 months of judgment, one lifetime of what men chose to know not to know. Her voice when she answered him was not tender. It was not cruel. It was the voice of a woman who had already made peace with the thing she was about to say, did not require his agreement with it. "The earth has been holding us up my whole life, Mr. Rennick. All I did was ask it to hold us a little closer." He put his face in his gloved hand. He did not answer for a long time. He was thinking about a knot in the pine floor of the town hall in October, about a chisel in a back shed at Christmas, about a small envelope in a drawer that said in his own hand, "For Miss Halloway from a friend of Elias." He was thinking about how in the end, the money in the envelope had been the smallest, least honest of the debts he owed, how he was going to have to find a way to pay the true one with something other than coin. He lifted his head. He looked at her. He said quietly, my boy. Ida, they are in the house. The floor. I do not think we have a day. She rose at once. She did not exclaim. She crossed to a corner where a rolled length of rope leaned against the wall, a second clothesline she had prepared for a purpose. He did not yet understand, she said without turning around. Then we go now. You go back the way you came. Mr. Rennick, along your rope, you bring them here. Bring what wraps them. Bring nothing else. If you pass the Whitlock house, you pound on their door. If you pass the Thorn house, you pound on theirs. Tell them what you have seen. If they will come, they come. If they will not, that is on their own account. But do not stay in your own house another hour to argue with your own pride. He stared at her. My pride. She met his eye. Not you, Mr. Rennick. The pride in the walls. She said it without heat. It was a small, precise correction, the kind a teacher makes to a child who has almost gotten a sum right. He nodded. He took the second glove off. He rubbed the feeling back into his hands with a slow, patient friction he had learned in his first winter in these mountains. He put both gloves back on. He wound the muffler back around his face. He picked up the tin cup from the floor beside him, drank the last of the hot water in one long swallow, set the cup back down. He said one more thing. The Whitlock woman. Cordelia. She is sick. Her lungs. I heard it 2 Sundays ago in her voice from the second row. Merritt's face did not change. Then bring her first. Bring her fastest. Do you hear me? He heard her. He stepped out of the shack back into the storm. The storm had not softened in the hour he had been inside, but he had. He had come through the door as a man being killed by a house he had built. He went back through the door as a man carrying a small, hard piece of information that was worth more than any board he had ever planned, which was the certainty that a warm place existed, that he knew where it was. He found his rope. He put his gloved hand around it. He did not let go of it for the next hour. Or 40 minutes. He walked back into the wind the way a man walks back into a room where he has left something he intends to fetch. Halfway to town, he angled off the trail at a point he knew by the change in the slope of the ground, he found by feel by the memory of 40 years of walking the church path, the front porch of the parsonage. Hun hammered on the door with the flat of his gloved fist, once, twice, 6 times, until the door opened 4 inches on a chain. Eulalie Doss's small, hard face appeared in the gap. She did not exclaim at the sight of him. She only said quickly, "Come in close it." He squeezed through the gap. She shut the door behind him, threw the bolt. Reverend Whitlock stood in the middle of the parlor holding a fireplace poker. He had the wild eyes of a man who has not slept, has been trying for 8 hours to solve a problem with the wrong tools. Behind him on the parlor settee, Cordelia Whitlock lay under 3 quilts with her mouth open. Cyrus heard from across the room the wet rattle her breathing had begun to acquire. He did not stop to be polite. He crossed the parlor in 3 strides. He took the Reverend by the shoulders, through the 2 heavy coats, he said, "Close hard so the Reverend would have to listen, Ephraim. There is a warm room, down at the creek. The Halloway girl has built one. I have been in it. Cordelia is going. You are going. Now." Whitlock stared at him. "Cyrus, what are you saying?" He shook the Reverend once. "I am saying she was right. We were wrong if you do not put your wife into a wool blanket. In the next 5 minutes, she is going to die in this parlor tonight." He turned to Eulalie. She was already moving. She had a wool comforter around Cordelia's shoulders before Cyrus had finished speaking. She was jerking her chin at the Reverend to help her lift. The Reverend, who had not received a real order from a woman in his life, obeyed as though he had been trained for it. Between the 3 of them, they got Cordelia off the settee wrapped, standing more or less, though she could not walk without support. Eulalie put her own coat on over her house dress. She wrapped her head in a woolen shawl until only her eyes showed. She said to Cyrus without turning her head, "Led. We follow." The Reverend. "I will carry her between us. Do not walk faster than she can go." They stepped out into the storm as a chain of 4, Cyrus at the front. On the rope, Cordelia held upright between her husband, her housekeeper, all of them roped loosely together at the waist by a length of clothesline Cyrus had insisted on before they left. The passage from the parsonage to the Thorn house was less than 300 feet in ordinary weather. It took them the better part of half an hour. Cordelia did not speak. She breathed wetly into the wool over her mouth. Each breath was a small argument she was making against the cold on her own behalf. Cyrus listened to each breath as he pulled them along. He counted them the way another man might have counted paces. He found the thorn porch by the newel post of the front stair, which he recognized by feel because he had turned it himself on a lathe in the summer of 1878. He hammered on the door. It opened almost at once as though someone on the other side had been standing near it. Adeline Thorne, not Barnaby, opened the door. She had her 7-year-old daughter clutched against her hip. Behind her in the dim hall, Cyrus could see the small 4-year-old boy standing very still, with his arms wrapped around his own chest, wearing what looked like every piece of clothing his mother had been able to layer onto him. He did not have to explain. Adeline took one look at Cordelia Whitlock's face over Eulalie's shoulder. Her own face went still. Barnaby is upstairs with the last of the wood. We have 1 hour of fire left, Cyrus. Maybe 2. Adeline, get the children. Get coats. There is a warm room at the creek. He heard himself say it. He heard how it must sound to a woman who had spent her married life inside the largest, best-provisioned house in Hollowford Bend. He heard at the same time the wet rattle behind him from Cordelia Whitlock. He saw Adeline's face make the calculation in one clean motion. She did not ask him to explain. She turned into the hall. She set up the stairs, her voice pitched to Carrie Barnaby. Come down. We are leaving. Bring the children's blankets. Bring the whiskey. Do not stop for anything else. Barnaby Thorne came down the stairs of his own house for what would prove to be the last easy walk he would take down them in his life. He had a bottle of rye in one hand, a stack of small quilts in the other, a face that had aged 5 years in a night. He saw Cyrus in the doorway with a rope, a widow's housekeeper, a dying minister's wife, his own wife with their children packed into every wool garment they owned. He opened his mouth to ask a banker's question, which was some version of what does this cost? He closed it. He had seen Adeline's face. He was not whatever else, he was a stupid man. He nodded once. He said only lead rennick. We will keep up. They stepped off the thorn porch into the storm as a chain of 9, now 3 adults, each of whom had never done a physically dangerous thing in their lives. One housekeeper worth all 3 of them. 2 small children roped between their parents at the waist. One dying woman held upright between a minister, a maid Cyrus Rennick at the head of the line, pulling them along a length of manila rope through a wind that could still take the skin off a man's face, no longer seemed to care whether it did. The wind had shifted. That was the small, terrible mercy. It came now not straight into their faces but at their left cheek, which meant that if he kept his shoulder into it, he could still walk, which meant that Prudence Thorne, roped between her mother-father with her small face buried in the fur trim of Adeline's collar, could still breathe. Thomas, the 4-year-old, was slung across his father's shoulder, inside 2 of the small quilts. Cyrus could hear the boy's breath through the wool, quick, shallow, but steady. Steady was all he was asking of anyone tonight. The passage from the thorn porch to the shack by Kettle Brook was the longest, most careful walk Cyrus Rennick had ever taken. He counted his paces from the porch. He knew that 480 of his own paces would put him at the last downhill pitch. He counted them because counting was a small task the mind could do while the body was doing the impossible, because he had learned 20 years ago on a bridge job that had gone bad in Wyoming that a man who counted did not panic. He counted. He counted. He felt the ground under his boots begin to fall away toward the creek. He knew he was close. He turned to check the line behind him. They were all still there. That was the thing he could not quite believe when he turned. All 8 of them, roped, moving, still upright, still breathing. Cordelia was leaning most of her weight on Eulalie. Now her breath had gone thinner, but she was walking. Prudence had begun a small, high, thin whimper into her mother's collar that Cyrus could hear even over the wind, but she was walking too, her little boots picking themselves up out of the snow with a stubbornness she had not inherited from her father. Barnaby Thorne, whom Cyrus had never once in 20 years seen work with his hands, had his 4-year-old son slung across one shoulder, the bottle of rye jammed inside his coat. He was walking one deliberate step after another with the concentration of a man who had discovered in the last hour of his life what his hands were actually for. Cyrus turned back into the wind. He walked the last 100 paces. He walked into the wall of Merritt Halloway's shack the second time, exactly as he had walked into it the first time, by the sudden yielding softness of banked sod against his outstretched glove. He found the door. He opened it. He stepped aside. He watched one by one as 8 people who had condemned or ignored or forgotten a 19-year-old widow in October ducked their heads, stumbled through the low doorway of the 12 by 14-foot shack she had rebuilt out of ruin, were received without a word of triumph, without a word of reproach by the girl herself. She had already moved the pine table to the wall. She had already spread the second wool blanket on the pine floor in the warmest corner near the grate. She had already put a second kettle on the stove. She had already, Cyrus saw with a small choked feeling in his chest that he could not name, unfolded a small quilt of her own, spread it on the blanket for the smaller of the two Thorn children. A small quilt that he recognized after a stupid, uncomprehending moment as one of the quilts that had been in Elias Halloway's cabin the day the town took it from her. She had kept one. He wondered when. He wondered how. He did not ask. She took Cordelia Whitlock first exactly as she had said she would. She did not send the Reverend Eulalie to lay her down. She took Cordelia's weight herself, though she was half the older woman's size. She guided her the 4 steps across the shack to the pine table. She had moved into a makeshift bed with the 2 remaining blankets. She said to Eulalie without looking at her warm broth in the small pot, 1 cup only sip by sip. Do not let her lie flat, she will drown in her own lungs. Eulalie was already at the stove. She took the 4-year-old Thomas next. She lifted him out of his father's arms without asking, without ceremony, without the smallest visible surprise at holding a banker's son against her own shoulder. She carried him to the quilt on the floor by the grate. She set him down on it. His small face was pale as skimmed milk. She unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his coat, worked one small mittened hand out of a sleeve, took the mitten off, held his bare hand between both of her own for a long, slow half a minute watching his face. The color came back to his cheeks in a thin, uncertain wash. He looked up at her out of large, tired eyes. He did not know her. He said very small, "Are you the lady from the story?" She almost smiled. She did not quite. She said, "I am the lady from the shack. This is a warm floor. You are going to be warm now." He nodded once gravely as a 4-year-old will nod when he has decided to trust a person. He lay down on his side on the quilt. He closed his eyes. She took a Prudence next. The 7-year-old had begun to cry properly now that she was inside warm enough to feel her own face again. A thin, exhausted crying that was mostly relief. Merritt did not try to hush her. She sat down on the pine floor beside the girl, cross-legged. She put one arm around her, let her cry into the wool of her shawl for as long as she needed to. She looked over the child's head at Adeline Thorne. Adeline Thorne looked back at her. Something passed between the 2 women in that single glance that Cyrus Rennick, who missed very little in a room he was reading, did not understand but recognized as important. It was not forgiveness. It was not gratitude. It was a small, clean recognition between 2 women that they were both tonight on the same side of a line neither of them had drawn. Prudence's crying slowed. Merritt untied the girl's small knit hat, smoothed her hair back from her forehead, with the flat of one hand said quietly into the top of her head, "You are safe now." Prudence's small body relaxed against her, the way a body relaxes only when it has been given permission by someone it has decided to believe. Barnaby Thorne stood in the middle of the shack with his empty arms held slightly out from his sides, as though he did not know what to do with them now that they were empty. He looked at his wife on the floor beside the widow he had condemned in October. He looked at his son asleep on a quilt he vaguely recognized. He looked at his daughter with her forehead pressed against the shawl of the girl he had taken a cabin from. His face did a thing Cyrus had never seen it do, which was to be entirely without expression. Cyrus understood that Thorne was not empty in that moment, but full past the point where a face like his could show anything. Thorne cleared his throat once. He said thickly, "Miss Halloway." She looked up at him from the floor, one arm still around his daughter. Her gray eyes were quiet. He tried again. "Miss Halloway." He could not finish the sentence. She let him not finish it. She said only, "Sit down, Mr. Thorne. There is a place by the wall. Take the whiskey out of your coat before you sit, or you will break the bottle." He looked down at himself at the shape of the bottle inside his coat that he had entirely forgotten. He laughed one small broken laugh. He took the bottle out of his coat. He sat down against the wall. He did not speak again for 2 hours. Cyrus Rennick went back into the storm one more time that night. He went for Ida. He went for Wesley. He went with a fresh knot of resolve tied into him, where the fear had been because he had seen the room, because he had seen what a 19-year-old widow had done with a shovel. A book, a piece of knowledge she had refused to be laughed out of, because he could not, having seen it, leave his own wife's son in a house that was becoming a coffin one floorboard at a time. The rope was still tied to his own porch post. He followed it home. He found Ida standing in the front hall with Wesley wrapped in the last of the wool blankets in her arms, ready as she had told him she would be ready. She did not ask him what he had found. She only said, "Take Wesley. I have the small bag." She stepped out onto her own porch for what would prove to be the last time. The passage back to the shack was harder because Cyrus was tired now in a way he had not let himself feel on the way in. But he had the boy in his arms, Ida behind him on the rope. He counted his paces again. He found the door again by feel. He set his shoulder to it. It opened for him for the second time in one night. He carried his son over the threshold. He set the boy down on the pine floor in the small, warm corner Merritt had prepared without being asked. Beside the sleeping thorn child, he watched Ida come through the door behind him. Stop, one hand still on the frame. Take in the small, crowded warm room with the slow, careful eyes of a woman who had grown up in a country where weather was the only real government, who understood in a single look what she was standing inside of. Ida Rennick, who had not cried in 7 years, put a hand over her mouth. Merritt Halloway rose from the pine floor. She crossed the small, warm room to the wife of the master carpenter. She took Ida's other hand in both of hers, she said quietly, so that only Ida heard. "Welcome, Mrs. Rennick. There is room. There has always been room." Ida Rennick, who was a broad, calm woman, not a woman given to demonstration, put her forehead down against the shoulder of a 19-year-old widow she had never spoken to. She wept once, one dry, hard sob. Then she straightened. She went to work because there was broth on the stove, a sick woman on the table, a wet-lunged child breathing shallow in a corner. Ida Rennick had been raising, tending a household for 26 years. She knew what her hands were for. The storm did not soften for another day or another after that. Inside the small, warm shack, 17 people slept in shifts, ate broth in shifts, sat up with a sick minister's wife in shifts. A 19-year-old widow moved among them without triumph, without display. Cordelia Whitlock's fever broke on the second night. She woke at some black hour asking for water in a voice that had gone thin but no longer wet. Eulalie Doss, sitting beside her on a low stool, cried without making any sound, only her shoulders shaking. Then she gave Cordelia the water in careful small sips. The Reverend, who had been sleeping on the floor at the foot of the table with his hand around his wife's ankle, through the blanket, the whole time woke to the sound of her drinking, sat up, put his forehead against the edge of the pine, said nothing for a long time. The 4-year-old Thomas woke the next morning with color in his cheeks, hunger in his voice. He sat up on his quilt, looking around at the strange warm room with the clear-eyed interest of a small boy who has decided that he is no longer afraid. Merritt gave him a corner of cornbread, a tin cup of warm broth. He ate. He watched her over the rim of the cup. He said more soberly than a 4-year-old ought to be able to say anything, "The floor is warm, lady." She said, "Yes, it is." He said, "We did not have a warm floor." She said, "I know." He drank his broth. When he was done, he climbed off the quilt, walked the 2 steps to where his mother sat against the wall, put his hand on Adeline's knee, said in the same sober voice, "Mama, we should have a warm floor at home." Adeline Thorne put her hand over her mouth. She looked at Merritt across the small room. She did not speak. She did not have to. Prudence Thorne spent the second day sitting close to Merritt wherever Merritt happened to be. She did not talk much. She watched. She watched Merritt boil water. She watched Merritt cut smoked elk into small strips with a paring knife. She watched Merritt bank the fire. Once when Merritt was reading her grandmother's book by the candle at the pine table, Prudence climbed up onto the bench beside her, looked at the spidery handwriting on the page, said, "Is that a real book?" Merritt said it was my grandmother's. Prudence said, "What does it say?" Merritt read her a recipe for rose hip syrup that Delphia had written down 40 years before in a cabin 2,000 miles east. Prudence listened as though she were being told a secret. When the recipe was over, she said, "I want to learn to make it." Merritt said, "When the roses come back, we will." Prudence nodded once the way her small brother had nodded the day before gravely, as a child nods when she has decided to trust a person. She leaned her head against Merritt's arm. She stayed there for a long time. Wesley Rennick spent the 2 days of the storm at the pine floor by the grate on his belly, his ear pressed to the wood, listening to the slow, patient breath of the earth moving through the plenum beneath him. He did not speak much either. He was 9 years old. He was his father's son. He was learning in the only way a builder's child learns anything important, which is by putting his ear to the thing. On the second afternoon, he looked up, said to no one in particular, It sounds like the creek. Ida, who was stirring broth at the stove, looked at her husband. Cyrus was watching his son with an expression Ida had not seen on his face since the boy's first day of walking. Cyrus said quietly, "That is because it is the creek, Wesley," in a manner of speaking. Wesley thought about that. He put his ear back to the wood. He said, "Well, I like it." He stayed there another hour. Barnaby Thorne did not speak much during the 2 days. He sat against the wall. He drank one small cup of the rye he had brought no more. He watched his wife tend his children. He watched the widow he had condemned move through her own small home with the quiet competence of a woman who had built the home with her own hands, was not going to make any of them feel bad about needing it. On the morning of the 20th of January, in the second gray hour before dawn, he crossed the room to where Merritt was banking the stove. He said low so as not to wake anyone, "Miss Halloway." She looked up. He said, "When this is over, when we get back into town, there are things that have to be undone." I did not know what to say next. She saved him from it. She said, "When this is over, Mr. Thorne, we will all have plenty of work to do. Now bank the fire with me. There is a knack to it." He knelt down beside her at the stove, a 50-year-old banker in a coat worth more than her cabin had ever been assessed at. He watched a 19-year-old widow show him how to lay a piece of pine across the coals so that it would burn slow through the last hour of the storm. He did as she showed him. He did it right on the second try. The storm broke on the morning of the 22nd of January at about 10 o'clock. It did not taper. It stopped. 1 minute the wind was still shrieking around the sod-banked walls of the shack. The next minute the wind was gone in its place. There was a silence so vast that Merritt, standing at the door with her hand on the wooden bar, thought for the second time that winter that she might have gone deaf. She opened the door. The world outside had been remade for the second time in 80 days this time, in a light so sharp, so clean it hurt the eyes. The sky was a color of blue that did not seem possible, a blue that had been washed of every impurity by 3 days of wind. The peaks of the San Juan stood white against it, distant without menace. The snow lay across the flat by the creek in immense sculpted drifts that rolled away toward the town like the surface of a frozen sea. There was no sound anywhere in the valley except faint from Kettle Brook, the running of black water beneath ice. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Behind her, one by one, the 16 people she had sheltered began to come to the door to look. They did not speak. They stood in the doorway in ones, twos. They looked out at the changed country. They went back inside without a word. There was in each of their faces the same expression, an expression that had less to do with the beauty of the morning than with the private understanding that they were still alive to see it. Cyrus Rennick was the first to speak. He said quietly to no one in particular, "We need to check on the others." The others meant the 20 families in Hollowford Bend who were not in this shack. It meant in particular the 3 families out on the south end of Main Street whom no one had heard from since the storm began. The families of a wheelwright named Lark, a farrier named Doss, who was Eulalie's brother-in-law, a widowed schoolteacher named Meade, whose small frame house sat furthest from any neighbor. Cyrus said their names quietly. Eulalie Doss's face went still. She said, "My brother-in-law's boy is only 7. Cyrus said, "I know." Merritt said, "Take Otho's rope. Take my extra blankets. Take the 2 smallest kettles. If they are cold but breathing, warm them slowly. Do not rush the warming. Do not let anyone lie flat." She said all of this in the voice she had used on the night of the storm, the voice of a woman who had thought through every possible variety of trouble a person could get into, in the cold come out with a plan on the other side. Cyrus Barnaby the Reverend went out together as a chain of 3 roped at the waist, the shovels she had used to build the trench in October slung over their shoulders. They came back an hour later leading a small ragged procession. The Lark family, 4 of them wrapped in every blanket they had. The Doss family, 5 of them, including the 7-year-old boy, who was pale but conscious, was walking on his own 2 feet, with his father's hand on his shoulder. The schoolteacher, Meade alone but upright, a small carpet bag of books clutched against her chest, as though the books were what had kept her alive, which in a private sense they had. They came into the shack in a slow, astonished silence. 16 became 29. There was physically no room. There was in some other sense that the shack seemed to be making up its own rules about room. Merritt did not remark on it. She moved the pine table again. She spread the last of her blankets. She heated broth for 11 more people. Ida Rennick, Adeline Thorne, Eulalie Doss worked beside her without being asked. 3 women who 2 weeks ago had not spoken to each other in any depth. 3 women who moved now around a small, warm room with the coordinated efficiency of a household that had been running for years. The 7-year-old Doss sat on Eulalie's lap with a cup of broth in both his small hands. He drank it in slow, careful sips because his aunt was showing him how he looked around the crowded shack with the frank, curious eyes of a child who has just been given his life back. Does not yet know what to do with the interest on it. His father, a hard-faced man named Rulon Doss, who had once in October laughed at a rude joke about the widow at Kettle Brook that a man at the mercantile had told sat beside them on the pine floor, held his son's foot inside its blanket. In one large hand wept quietly into his own coat sleeve, without making any sound at all. The schoolteacher Meade sat with her carpet bag of books at her feet, took the cup of broth Merritt handed her, said very softly without meeting anyone's eye, "Thank you, Miss Halloway." Merritt said, "Please, call me Merritt." Miss Meade nodded. She drank her broth. After a long while, she said, still not looking up, "I had made peace with dying Merritt. I want you to know that. I was not angry, I was not afraid. I was just very cold." She looked up then. Her eyes were the eyes of a woman of 40 who had spent 12 years teaching other people's children in a town that had never once thought to ask her if she was lonely. She said, "I do not know how to thank you for making me have to unmake that peace." Merritt sat down on the bench beside her. She said quietly so that only Miss Meade heard, "You thank me by teaching us all what you know when we come out of this." She meant it. Miss Meade understood that she meant it. Something in her face that had been closed for 12 years began very slowly to open. The 29th person in the shack was a small tabby cat that had followed the Doss family through the drifts, that had walked in behind them without asking, that had gone directly to the grate over the plenum, curled up on it, gone to sleep as though she had been waiting all winter for the invitation. Wesley Rennick, watching her, said that cat knows about the warm floor. Cyrus said, "Everybody knows about the warm floor now, Wesley. Everybody who is going to know." That night, the second night of the calm after the storm, the 29 people slept in the small warm shack in an arrangement that no census would ever properly describe. On the third morning, the 23rd of January, they began the slow work of returning to their houses. It was not a triumphant return. It was a stunned, careful reckoning. They found the town damaged in ways it would take weeks to catalog. The church steeple had come down on the 20th in the middle of the night. The Thorne second-story porch was gone. Halloran's back kitchen window was a hole. Wood piles had been buried under drifts that would not thaw until April. But every family that had been in the shack came home. Every family that had been in the shack over the next 4 days went out into the town with Merritt's directions to check on the neighbors they had not been able to reach during the storm. 6 more households were found. 2 of them had let their fires go out, had been an hour or two from the dangerous stillness that the cold used as a doorway. All of them, warm, carefully fed, carefully given time, came back to themselves. Not a single household in Hollowford Bend in the end went silent under the long white silence. Not one. That fact, more than any other, was the fact that would be argued about in Halloran's mercantile for the next 40 years. The old-timers, until the day they died, would say plainly the reason nobody was lost in that storm is that a 19-year-old widow had built a warm room by a creek that a 51-year-old carpenter had had the sense in the 11th hour to walk to it. The reckoning came on the 28th of January in the town hall, where the judgment had been read the previous October. The town filled the room past its walls. People stood in the doorway. People stood out on the plank walk in the cold, listening through the open door. Merritt Halloway sat in the back in a plain black wool dress, a little more worn than it had been in October. Her hair braided back tight, a shawl the color of dried moss around her shoulders. Beside her on one side sat Otho Beach, whom she had asked to come down from Copper Ridge for the day. On the other side sat the schoolteacher, Miss Meade. In the front rows sat every family that had been in the shack, arranged not by rank or family, but by the seating order the shack itself had happened to give them. Barnaby Thorne stood up first. He was not a man who had ever learned to speak plainly in public. He did the best he could. He said, "I have been a fool. I said it 3 nights ago to my wife. I will say it now to every person in this room. In October, we sat behind that table. We passed a judgment on a young woman that had no honest math in it. The cabin, the acres of Elias Halloway, were worth more than $700, not 15. I authorized the assessment. I signed the paper. I did it because it was expedient, because no one in this room stood up to stop me." He looked around the room, met eyes. That was the smallest of the wrongs. The larger wrong was that we then sent her to a shack we believed she would die in. We did it with a straight face. We did it under the word charity. If she had died in that shack, we would have buried her with a straight face too. We would have said God's providence. We would have gone back to our ledgers. Instead, she lived. Instead, she saved the lives of every person in this room, of some who are not in this room. He paused. He said the last part slowly. The Halloway cabin, the 160 acres, are hereby returned in full to Miss Merritt Halloway, effective the moment I finish speaking. The debt of the late Elias Halloway is not merely canceled. It is declared by the honest arithmetic of what has happened this month to have been paid many times over. It should never have existed to begin with. I owe her personally an amount of money I do not know how to calculate. I owe her personally an apology I do not know how to word. I will spend the rest of my working life trying. He sat down. His wife took his hand. Reverend Whitlock stood up next. He had lost weight during the storm. It made him look for the first time in his adult life like a man rather than a pulpit. He said the Bible speaks of the humble of the proud. I have preached those verses for 31 years without understanding them. I preached them last October standing behind that table. I told this young woman that the laws of God required order, that order required her to accept charity. I did not know, then I did not want to know, that the true providence was already at work in her, that she was already listening to a voice I had grown deaf to. He looked at Merritt. He said quietly, "Miss Halloway, my wife is alive because of you." He could not go on. He sat down. Cordelia Whitlock, sitting beside him, thin but upright, put her thin hand on top of her husband's, kept it there. Cyrus Rennick stood up last. He did not walk to the front of the room. He stood where he was at the end of his own bench so that everyone in the room had to turn a little to look at him. He said, "I built the house I nearly killed my family in. That is the whole of what I know how to say about myself this morning. Every joint in that house is tight. Every board is true. Every window is set square. On the second night of the storm, the floor of my kitchen turned to ice from below. My son could not walk on it in his boots. My wife was 10 degrees warmer upstairs than my son was in his own kitchen. If I had stayed in that house another 6 hours, if a widow had not built a room I could walk to, we would have been 3 of the households the Reverend eulogized this Sunday. Not because of pride exactly, because of ignorance. Because in 20 years of building houses in this valley, I had never once, not once, put my ear to the ground I was building on." He turned his head. He looked at Merritt. "Miss Halloway, I owe you a debt I cannot pay in coin. I have an envelope in the drawer of my workbench that I meant to give you at the thaw. It has $11 in it. I ask you now publicly to accept the money as the smallest part of what I owe. The rest of it I will pay by learning what you know, by putting my hands, my 40 years of craft at your service, until you tell me the debt is done. I will teach my son to lay a warm channel before I teach him to plane a board. I ask you to teach me first so that I may teach him." He waited. Merritt Halloway stood up. She did not walk to the front of the room either. She said from the back quietly, but in a voice that carried, because a room full of people who have decided to listen will hear a whisper, "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Thank you, Reverend. Thank you, Mr. Rennick. I will take the cabin back. I will take the $11. I do not need an apology for October because the apology has already been paid in the labor of getting 8 people through a wind, in the labor of getting 11 more people out of their houses when it was over. That is the only apology I recognize. It is enough." She paused. She said more quietly, "Still, the earth has been holding us up all our lives. All I did was ask it to hold us a little closer. If you want to make good on your promises, that is the lesson to learn. It is not mine. It was my grandmother's. It will be your children's if we teach them. I will teach anyone who comes to Kettle Brook to learn. There is no charge. There is no charity. There is only the work." She sat back down. The town hall was silent for a long moment. Then Otho Beach from beside her said in his dry old voice, "That ain't a bad sermon for a girl who don't preach." A ripple of something that was not quite laughter, not quite weeping, ran through the room. It was the sound of a town beginning to be human again. Spring came slowly to Hollowford Bend that year, as it always did, the last drifts holding on in the shadowed places until the middle of May. But by the first week of March, the roads were open. By the middle of March, the first small green shoots were coming up along the south banks of Kettle Brook. By the end of the month, the school teacher Miss Mead had begun holding an unofficial afternoon class at Merritt's shack twice a week, in which the older children of the town, having convinced their parents that the shack was the most interesting building in the valley, gathered around the pine table with slates on their laps to hear Merritt explain in language patient enough for 9-year-olds the principles of the thing under the floor. She drew diagrams in charcoal on the pine boards. She explained thermal mass, the frost line, the constant giving temperature of the deep ground, the physics of passive circulation in a plain, unornamented way that made complicated things seem obvious. The way her grandmother had once made the shelling of peas seem like the natural next thing in the world to do. Wesley Rennick sat at the front of every class. Prudence Thorne sat beside him. Miss Mead sat at the back with her carpet bag of books at her feet, took her own careful notes on a fresh page of the ledger she had used for 12 years to teach spelling, made her own quiet vow that in the fall term she was going to teach every child in Hollowford Bend how to read the ground beneath their houses, along with how to read the words in their books. By April, Cyrus Rennick had begun the retrofit of his own house at the north end of Main Street. He dug the trench himself with his own hands, though Wesley helped in the smaller work, though half the men of the town who had seen the shack came down to lend a shoulder or a shovel for an afternoon at a time. He built the plenum by lantern light in the evenings. He laid the pine floor over it with the joinery that had made him famous in the valley, though this time the joinery was in service of a knowledge older than his own trade. On the day he was done, he brought Ida Wesley into the kitchen. He had them stand on the new floor in their stocking feet. He watched their faces. Ida did not speak for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Well, Cyrus, that is a floor." Wesley said, "It feels like the shack." Cyrus said, "That is the point, son." By May, Barnaby Thorne's house had a warm channel running from its front parlor, down beneath the frost line, to a spring that came up in his back garden. He had not dug the trench himself. He had hired the labor at fair wages. He had watched every foot of it. From the edge he had learned, standing there in a coat that was too heavy for the weather, more than he had learned in 20 years of banking. On the first day the channel breathed, he stood in his parlor with Adeline Prudence Thomas. He pressed his palm against the pine floor, exactly the way he had watched Cyrus Rennick press his palm against a different pine floor. 3 months before he said quietly, so that only his family heard, "We will never lose a floor to the cold again, Adeline. I have made sure of it." Adeline said, "I know." Prudence said from beside them, "Are we going to Merritt's this afternoon?" Adeline said, "Yes. We are going to Merritt's this afternoon." Prudence said, "Good. I have something for her." On the last afternoon of May, when the aspens along the ridge were coming back into their first pale green, when the willows along Kettle Brook had begun to soften with new leaves, when the whole valley was for a few weeks the greenest, kindest country in the United States. Merritt Halloway stood in the doorway of her shack, watching a small delegation of townspeople walk down the trail toward her. Miss Mead was at the front with a basket of new bread. Ida Rennick Adeline Thorne walked behind her. Wesley Prudence Thomas walked between them, kicking at the last of the mud along the path. Cyrus's crew of 4 followed with a wagon full of squared timber for the addition Merritt had agreed to let him build onto the shack, an addition that would double its size, would incorporate a proper kitchen, would be, when finished, the first fully purpose-built breathing hearth structure in the state of Colorado. The children reached her first. Wesley showed her a small carved wooden badger he had made with his father in the workshop over the winter, which he presented to her with the sober formality of a 9-year-old giving his first significant gift. Thomas, 4 now, for 4 more months, held up his arms to be picked up, which she did without hesitation, without ceremony, because he had earned the right to be picked up on the night he had told her that his floor at home was not warm. Prudence, 7, waited until Merritt had set Thomas back down. Then she stepped forward with something small held cupped in both her hands. She had a length of blue ribbon in her hands. Not new ribbon. A ribbon that had been carefully unpicked from the hem of her mother's second-best Sunday dress that had been washed-pressed wound into a small tight coil. She held it out to Merritt without a word. Merritt knelt down in front of her so that their eyes were level. She said, "Prudence, that is your mother's ribbon." Prudence said with the sober certainty her small brother had inherited from her mama, said, "I could have it. I want you to have it." Merritt said, "Why?" Prudence looked at her steadily. She said, "Because you were the lady from the shack. Mama said the lady from the shack is the reason we still have a mama." She thought for a moment. Then she added in the same steady voice, "Also, I like you." Merritt Halloway, who had not cried since the burial of her husband in September, who had not cried through the taking of her cabin in October, who had not cried through 2 months of digging in November-December, who had not cried through 3 days of a killing storm in January, who had not cried through the sight of 29 people alive in her shack. When the wind stopped, put her arms around a 7-year-old banker's daughter in the doorway of a shack that had once been a ruin. She cried once, one clean sob into the top of Prudence's head. Prudence, 7 years old, put her small arms around Merritt's neck, patted her hair with the flat of one small hand, the way she had seen her mother pat her father's hair on hard nights, said, "It is all right, Merritt. It is all right. Everything is warm now." Merritt straightened. She took the length of blue ribbon in her fingers. She looked at it at the child who had given it to her, at the small delegation of townspeople behind the child, at the aspens, on the ridge behind them, at the running water of Kettle Brook, beyond that, at the whole country that had judged her, tried to kill her, learn from her, come in the end, to sit at her table. She turned. She walked into the shack. She tied the length of blue ribbon in a small, careful knot around the frame of the doorway, where anyone coming in or going out for the rest of the years, the shack would stand, which would prove to be 47 of them, would see it, would ask about it, would be told the story. She turned back to the delegation in the doorway. She said quietly, "Come inside. There is fresh water on the stove. There is room. There has always been room." One by one, they came inside the 12 by 14-foot shack that had once been called a grave by the men who now sat at its table, opened its low door to the town that had learned at a terrible cost that the deepest wisdom is often buried, waiting only for someone with the courage to dig.